I am so dry. We need some rain, right? You know, I was really proud of myself on the day of my college graduation. And I was quite confident in the authority of my newly earned bachelor's degree. But my confidence was quickly shaken when I got to the ceremony and I saw there a whole lot of students who had been in school a good deal longer than I had been in school and who had learned a great deal more than I had learned. Those students were getting their master's degree. And along with that, piece of paper, they were also getting those wonderful hoods. I know some of you have your masters, and some of you are anticipating getting your masters. And if you don't know this, I didn't know it until that day, but when you get your master's degree, you get a hood that goes on your graduation, lovely graduation gown, right? And it's the color of your discipline. So if you're graduating, with say, a master's in religion or theology, I think the hood is scarlet. And I was quite enamored by those lovely hoods. And I decided as I watched those students receiving their color that I needed a hood of my own. I mean, how much more authority might I have with that extra piece of cloth dangling down the back of my graduation gown, right? Unless, of course, I also had the chevrons of a doctoral degree, right? Authority. When I was appointed to my first church, one of the men in the congregation had to build me a wooden box to stand on so I could see up over the pulpit. And when the church had a big bell outside with a rope that was rung every Sunday morning, and I was the person to ring it, but I had to stand on a little stool that my grandfather made me when I was a child in order to reach the rope to ring that big bell. And oh, everybody thought it was so precious. They had that cute little short preacher. But I was sensitive about that. I was really self-conscious about my size. That and the fact that I weighed about 104 pounds. I mean, I was a wisp of a pastor blowing through San Juan, New Mexico. And I was also embarrassed by the tenor of my voice. Always been ashamed, embarrassed by this voice that sounds like a 12-year-old child. And on top of that, I was pretty sensitive about my age, considering the fact that I was a lot younger than the vast majority of the people in that congregation. Those three things together, for me, were problematic because I was afraid that the people of the congregation and of the community were not going to be able to take me seriously. And lo, how I wanted to be taken seriously. So for that reason, I was really excited the year I turned 40. Because, when you're 40, you're finally a grown-up, right? The things you say actually matter, and the words and actions that you have are important to people. Well, I thought that at 39, but as you might guess, I learned that 40 really was no different than 39 or 38 or 37. And by the time I reached the ripe old age of 40 years and 6 months, I knew that my age did not grant me authority. I've reached a lot of milestones during the course of my vocation. And each time that I reached one of those milestones, I hoped that I would finally achieve this elusive authority that I felt like I needed and I so very much longed for. I thought that when I completed course of study school at Duke University, that I would gain people's respect. Or perhaps, it was that I needed to have 10 good years of ministry behind me, and then people would recognize me. Or maybe I needed to serve multiple churches, and then people would value my expertise. I'm happy to say this morning that the things which concerned me 18 and 15 and even 10 years ago are not the same things that concern me now. But we human beings do put a lot of stock in authority. Who has it and who doesn't? And who has enough of it to direct us and to teach us and to guide us? Who among us has the authority to assume leadership over us? As a traveling rabbi, Jesus was invited to teach at the local synagogue in Capernaum. That was a customary thing to do, to invite the visiting teacher to give the Sabbath day lesson. And on that particular day, those people who had gathered to hear Jesus, the folks in attendance there, were amazed by the authority with which he spoke and taught. He was nothing like the teachers that they were used to, the teachers of the law. Now, the teachers of the law were experts in the law of Moses. And when they taught, they were reliant on the great rabbis from Judaism's past. So they would quote these well-known authorities in order to emphasize their own authority. And we do the same thing. We quote informed people if we want our ideas and our opinions to be seriously considered. Just this week, in fact, I had a conversation with a really good friend of mine, dear friend, but she's also a colleague. And I mean, this woman is just crackerjack smart, super smart, very theologically inclined, really deep thinker. And so I was having a conversation with her about spirituality and theological things, and I wanted to express a personal belief. I wasn't real sure how she would accept. And so I referred to an author whom the both of us are familiar with. And I did that, as a way of giving a little more weight to my own idea, in case it was not as smart as I thought maybe it was. We do that. We often rely on the knowledge, or maybe even more than that, we rely on the wisdom of other people to give our own thoughts and ideas and opinions some merit, some authority. It's like that lovely hood of a master's degree, or the chevrons of a doctoral. It's like being a respectable age, or having enough experience under one's belt. We kind of lean into other sources and resources to validate our authority. The teachers of the law did the same thing. But Jesus didn't. And people noticed that he didn't. And they were impressed by that fact. They were struck by the authority that that he held within himself. And while this group of people was sitting around being amazed by Jesus, the story that Nell tells us says that an evil spirit started speaking through one of the men in the synagogue. "What do you want from us, Jesus of Nazareth?" I have no idea how evil spirits sound. No idea. They may not be the least bit freaky, but when I read their part, they are. "I know who you are. You're the Holy One of God." And Jesus ordered the spirit to be quiet. And he called that spirit out of the man. And with a shriek and with a shudder, it was gone. And everyone who witnessed the scene was awestruck. They were again amazed by the authority of Jesus. Not authority that he quoted from someone else. Not authority that he had learned or that he had borrowed. But authority that was just within him. Authority that was his own. And they kind of wanted to know who gave him that authority anyway. Where did it come from? Where did it originate? I don't know if you noticed this. So in Sunday school this morning, we were talking about a way of reading Scripture. It's called Lectio Divina. And it is often a way that I read Scripture in order to prepare for a sermon. And in doing that this week, I noticed something about this passage that I had never noticed before. There is a juxtaposition in the evil spirit's insight about Jesus and the insight of that congregation. The folks in the congregation, the folks in that synagogue were amazed that Jesus had this authority that was so different from any of their other teachers. They were amazed by it. But they had no idea where it came from. The Spirit, however, immediately recognized the source. In fact, that recognition alone was enough to cause that spirit to raise its ugly head. This traveling rabbi who amazed the crowd, who called out evil, and who taught with an innate authority, is, as the Spirit recognized, a revelation of God. In fact, the authority of Jesus itself is a manifestation of God acting in and through him. So maybe, I don't know, I'm wondering about this all week long, maybe epiphanies, we've been talking about epiphanies, right? Maybe epiphanies are just much more apparent on the spiritual realm. But the people gathered in the synagogue weren't able to see what that nasty little imp instinctively knew. The authority of Christ is unlike any other because it's birthed from God. And yet, how many times have we underestimated that authority? Where has the voice of God through Christ spoken into our lives and we haven't heard? Where have divine lessons been taught and we haven't learned? Where has God called out those unholy things that possess us, and yet we're unwilling to turn loose of that shrieking, shuddering thing? our ego-driven struggle for recognition and respect and expertise and authority. It's a great obstacle in hearing the authority of Christ. To reach that place of intimate relationship that Jesus shared with God, we first have to shed all of those things, those hoods and those chevron stripes and every other covering by which we have defined ourselves. We have to let them go. Because at some point they're absolutely meaningless. When we come before the Lord humble and unknown, that's when we prove ourselves. That's when we are redefined and reborn by the authority of God. When we can recognize Jesus not in human knowledge, all of these things that we learn about him, but when we can recognize Jesus as God's revelation through him, then we're stripped of any expertise that we might claim to have about him. And that's the point, church. That is the point when we truly see Jesus as just this humble teacher whose authority is over the entire earth. It's such a contradiction in terms that we really hesitate to trust it. But in this holy paradox, we find our salvation and God's saving grace. This visiting rabbi who amazes the crowd and calls out evil and teaches with innate authority is the one and only Holy One of God. And thanks be to God that he is. Amen and amen. Will you stand if you are able and join with me in the affirmation of faith, number 881 in our